Chapter 15. A Golden Idol. Oren wiped a smudge of ink from his thumb, then carefully dipped the split tip of his reed into the water pot, touching it lightly to the dry ink. He drew another line on the papyrus stretched before him. Silently he counted. He had been right the first time. It was 35 days since Moses had gone up into the mountain of God. Oren rocked back on his heels to think. What should he write next? Something was going on in the camp. He could not quite figure out what it was. His father returned from his meetings night after night with a grim look on his face. Across the room his mother sighed. Oren watched her glance at the open tent flap, frown, and return to her work. She too was worried. Everywhere Oren went he heard stories about the fate of Moses, who seemed to have disappeared. Some of them were as eerie as any of old pastors' tales had been. There was talk of choosing new leaders. Where was Moses? Oren wondered. This morning he had walked out to look at the mountain. Anyone could see that the cloud still sat covering its top. Maybe tomorrow Moses would return. He would be glad to add that to his book of their travels. His gift of ink from Pastor was almost gone. Gently he stirred the small bit of thick sediment that was left. If only he knew what to add that would keep the supply going. Pastor had known. A picture of Pastor sitting in his garden, papyrus in hand, passed through his mind. Mary? Would Mary know how to replenish the ink? Carefully he packed his tools away and picked up his crutch. He would find Mary and ask her. Sadly, Mary rubbed a bit of the ink between her thumb and forefinger. I know only that it was a metallic substance my uncle used to mix with charcoal. How or where he got it, I do not know. With the look of someone who had just an idea, Mary wiped her fingers and reached for a piece of goat skin. You could use this for parchment. I can scrape the hair from the skin for you, and the ink for it is easy to make. Oren fingered the goat skin. It would do. If the ink works, it will be fine, he said. Mary was already scraping away at the skin on her lap. All we need for the ink is right here, she said. One mixes charcoal and oil, though the exact amount is important. It took a bit of doing, but by the time Oren left, he was satisfied that the new ink would work. Mary watched him go, then hurried to pick up her water skin. Already the sun was beginning to weaken. No one would be at the water now. The shadows were lengthening as she finished filling the bag. She walked quickly, anxious not to be caught on the path in the dark. By now Hannah would be home and wondering about her. She had spent too long with the boy. The sight of him had brought back bittersweet memories from the past. Her uncle had really loved the child. Without warning, Manetto interrupted her thoughts. Mary gasped as he stepped into the path no more than 3 feet ahead of her. Sorry, little one. Sorry. I did not mean to startle you. Manetto held his hands palm up in a gesture of apology. You were deep in thought and perhaps did not hear me coming. No, I didn't hear you, Marie answered, forcing a calmness that she did not feel into her voice. Please let me pass. I am already late and will be missed. Manetto stepped aside quickly so that she could go ahead. Go and fulfill your duties tonight as usual, but soon you will see who are the true masters. Marie's instinct was to hurry past him. Instead, she looked searchingly at him. I do not know what you mean, she said. Manetto smiled that peculiar cold smile Mary hated. The God of the Hebrews no longer sends his priest. He has tired of this rabble of slaves. It is time for the power of the old gods once more. Those of us who knew them best shall be their trusted servants. Mary shrank back from the man. Yahweh would never allow such a thing. Manetto grinned. What do you fear, daughter of Nut? Marie turned her eyes from his face. Nut was Egypt's goddess of the sky. Never fear, little one. Manetto will see that you are well treated. Now go before Khonsu rises and spots you. Mary hurried past him, not slowing her pace nor stopping to look back. Khonsu was the moon god. She had heard stories of his affairs, none of them pleasing to her. This talk of the old gods in the camp of Yahweh frightened her. Above her the moon was indeed rising, and Mary stumbled in her haste, splashing a bit of the water over her sandals. As she straightened and steadied the water skin, she saw the shining cloud of Yahweh still above the mountain beyond the camp. Yahweh watches over his people, she thought inside. Whether for relief or wonder at the great mystery of Yahweh, she didn't know. Ahead, the light of Hannah's campfire welcomed her with dancing yellow brightness. 2 days later, Mary, her hands bound tightly behind her back, wept bitterly with longing for old Hannah and her welcoming campfire. Everywhere fires of rebellion burned in the camp. People seemed to have gone mad. Huge bonfires flamed far into the night while men and women danced about them wildly, some of them drunkenly. Women prepared food as for a great feast, and people donned their finest clothing. At the remote eastern edge of the camp, the strangers among the Hebrews had their tents. There, Mary sat on the ground before Manetto's tent watching the madness. Is this happening in all of the camp? She wondered. It was no use to struggle. Her wrists burned where the twisted vines binding them rubbed into her skin. If only she could free her hands, she could untie her feet from the stake Manetto had driven into the ground. The thought of his cruel smile made her squirm with anger. She had fought against his powerful grip tooth and nail. Why? Why had she gone again for water late in the evening when there was no one to help her? She should have known after Manetto's first visit that something like this could happen. She had seen the look of surprise, then anger on Manetto's face when she refused to go with him. I follow Yahweh now, can't you see? There is this cloud still on the mountain, she had said, pointing. For a minute, Manetto had hesitated. So you still think safety lies with these slaves? I will soon convince you how wrong you are, and then you will serve me, little sister. He had carried her off like a sack of grain, ignoring her struggles, one large hand covering her mouth. Mary licked her dry lips. All that was changed now. Manetto no longer tried to reason with her. There was no need now that the whole camp was bent on finding a new god to lead them. Manetto could choose a wife from those women who seemed to hang on his every word. They followed him about as if he were a god. This afternoon, 2 of them had painted her face and dressed her in garlands of flowers. You must be beautiful for the new god, one of them said. What new god? I belong to Yahweh, Mary cried out. The women had laughed. Just be patient, the other said. Soon you will see our new god. He is all golden. You'll love him. You'll see. The woman's voice was wobbly, her breath sour with the smell of wine. When they left, Mary wished she had begged them for a drink of water. Her face felt dry and heavy with paint, and her throat ached from the sobs that wrenched her. They would come for her when the sun set to take her to the new god. Horror filled her mind. If only Manetto would return before then, she would promise him anything to escape. The light was beginning to change, and still he had not come. Oh, help me, Yahweh. Please help me, she prayed. Nothing moved among the deserted tents. From somewhere on the north side of the camp, sounds of revelry carried on the air. Mary closed her burning eyes. Had she fallen asleep? Was that Ram coming towards her? It was Ram. Oh, help me, Ram, help me, she cried. Is it really you? Ram asked. What have they done to you? Without waiting for an answer, he went to work on the vines that bound Mary's feet. We've been looking everywhere for you, for 2 days, ever since Hannah couldn't find you. This was the last place I thought of to look. It was just a chance idea that made me come here. Mary held Ram's arm for a moment as she stood on her cramped legs. I would not leave Yahweh, but Manetto brought me here thinking to persuade me. They want to sacrifice me to their new god. She tore the garlands from her neck. Oh, Ram, what will we do? The peculiarly marked and painted face of Mary was eerie, but Ram could see fear in her eyes. We run, he said. Taking her hand, he headed west. Mary ran for her life, the blood coming back into her feet and legs like sharp knives. My father and some of the others have gone into the hills west of camp, Ram said, his breathing coming hard. He and Molid went down to the camp to reason, but they were outnumbered by the mobs. When the violence began, those who feared Yahweh fled to the hills. We'll be safe there. Ram glanced behind him as they ran. Any moment they could be pursued. They had to reach cover. In a thick shelter of rocks, they stopped to rest. It's not far now, Ram assured Mary as he leaned his back against a rock. They had reached the first hill, and Ram could see no sign of anyone following them. Mary sat on the ground and let her head droop against her drawn-up knees. Suddenly she began to rub her face with both hands. Jumping up, she looked about frantically. Ram sat up in alarm. I can't let anyone see me like this, Mary said half to herself. The small white flowers of a nearby broom bush caught her eye. In a moment she was tearing off handfuls of the sweet fragrant blooms to wipe the thick paint from her skin. When she finished, she was once more the plain-faced Mary that Ram knew, her face red from the rubbing, but clean. As they approached the small plateau, well hidden from the valley below, Tirzah ran from one of the tents to meet them. Impulsively, she threw her arms around Mary. You found her, she cried out. Standing back from Mary, Tirzah searched the girl's face. You are all right, aren't you, Mary? She asked. Mary could not control the tears that ran down her cheeks. I am safe. I could not go with Manetto and the others because I promised to follow Yahweh. They were going to give me to their new god. She covered her eyes for a moment, then went on. Oh, Tirzah, I prayed to Yahweh for help, and then Ram came. Some of the women gathered around, and now kind hands gently led Mary toward the tents. Tirzah stayed behind with Ram. Where did you find her, Ram? Ram sat down on the ground, suddenly tired. She was in the entryway to Manetto's tent, tied to a stake in the ground and dressed for sacrifice to the new god. He remembered Mary's strangely painted face, the garlands of flowers, the clothing, and shuddered to think of what might have been. Tirzah put a hand on Ram's shoulder. Whatever comes, Ram, I'm glad you are my brother. Ram looked at his sister, her slim frame, the bright intelligence of her eyes so like their father's. It's going to be all right, Tiz. We'll stick together, he said. Look, Ram, up there. Tirzah pointed to the top of the great mountain rising above all the other hills. See, Yahweh's cloud is still there. Ram stared at the cloud, glowing with fiery light as the night came on. We must just wait and see, Tiz. Wait and see. During the second watch of the night, Ram took his turn along with Abishur and his uncle Caleb, watching the narrow pass to the plateau. From the valley, they could hear the shouts and music of celebration. It's a terrible thing they do, his uncle said quietly. The people laid their earrings and necklaces at Aaron's feet and got him to melt them down. His uncle's voice trembled. What came from the fire was a thing of evil in the shape of a bull calf. Now they are calling it the god who brought them out of Egypt. Ram shivered in the cold night air. In the far distance, Yahweh's cloud still glowed about the mountaintop. Yahweh brought us out of Egypt, he said, and I will stand against any man who says otherwise. His uncle patted his arm, and Abishur's too. Good lads, both of you. We will watch sharp this night. Yahweh is not done with his people, though I fear his anger will fall on many. The night passed slowly till it was the third watch, and Ram gladly gave his place to his father and molded. Warily he stumbled back to the tent, flung himself down, and was asleep instantly. In a nearby tent, Mary snuggled close to old Hannah, who slept peacefully, a smile on her face. She was so glad that I am back, thought Mary. Tenderly, she pulled the robe up about Hannah's shoulders. Hannah would never let Manetto take her. A nagging fear rose to taunt her, but she shut her eyes tightly and let herself drift into sleep.